The book is about Kashmir, putting not just Kashmir in historic perspective, but also it's an attempt to humanize the story. I lived in Delhi for 10 years, and the thing that has struck me most repeatedly and sometimes agonizingly is the manner in which how misunderstood the subject is. Misunderstood will be an understatement, it's distorted. It's distorted also because of historic reasons and also how media has changed over the last few years. So there is, I mean, since it's not told from a human perspective, it's seen in terms of national security, in terms it's seen through the prism security. So over the years, what it has done, it has dehumanized Kashmiris to such an extent that even when floods hit the Kashmir Valley recently, the manner in which it was reported again underlined the need for humanizing this story. So there are historical reasons, and of late how the manner in which the media has changed, how jingoism has become a business model, has further complicated. I mean, media should have covered, I mean, it has been so for last 25 years. Had media shown the human side of the story, could have created some sense of empathy among the people who matter, who could, the media could have molded the public opinion in a manner where you would encourage the government to be just and more humane to Kashmir. So you can, imagine we have laws like Armed Forces Special Powers Act in place in Kashmir. So it's not, I mean, Armed Forces Special Act is essentially, it denies people the right to life, which is the most fundamental and basic right. So there are other such lawless laws. So you can imagine, and there's no, I mean, the levels of, earlier there was the excuse of militant violence. The parameters of militant violence, on all parameters, the violence is down by 98%. So despite that, the government has shown no willingness to even consider repealing these laws which deny, I mean, if deny the most basic human right, that's right to life, to remedy, and there are other lawless laws. Amnesty International called, there is another law called Public Safety Act, where you can put somebody in jail for 2 years without trial. So despite all these things, despite this extraordinary decrease in militant violence, it's almost dead. But yet the government is not even willing to consider repealing it. So it's also because we have dehumanized Kashmir to the extent that there is no public opinion far from being favorable towards it for just solution to Kashmir has actually turned hostile towards any just solution. So that's the basic idea why I've written this book, just putting a human face to the story. It has historical reasons. Also, the fact that it involves India and Pakistan. It's essentially a dispute. It's basically it's a troubled legacy which we trace to the partition of this country, and there are historical reasons. Historically, how British divided Indian history on communal lines, and to sustain their two-nation theory, which eventually degenerated into the partition of this country. So it's linked to that as well. So it makes it more complicated. There is the collective sense of history that the people of this country have. So historically as well, it's very difficult for people in this country to look at. I mean, it's also seen as a continuation of the so-called Muslim problem. So there are historical reasons, and the fact that it gets it involves Pakistan as well. So these are broadly the reasons why this thing has happened. And having said that, there are people in the media who have done tremendous job in highlighting the human rights abuses. And besides the local media, the Indian media, the foreign press has also done an incredible job, particularly in the 90s, when we had these massacres and even sexual violence was very common in the 90s. Now you have to look at from in 1947, when the country was divided on religious lines. Kashmir, being a Muslim majority state, was the most popular leader at that time, Sheikh Abdullah. He was instrumental in ensuring that in Kashmir stayed part of India. and this person, he negotiated his, I mean, there was this tribal raid, there was a war that took place in 1948, and there was this tribal, there was this force that Mr. Abdullah had raised, and virtually with bare hands they fought these raiders who had come from the tribal areas of Pakistan. And this man believed in Nehru's promises of democracy, of equal rights, secularism and everything. And when he started asking for what he was promised, he was put in jail for more than 25 years. So you can imagine the nature of the population of Kashmir was such that the establishment was always suspicious of the people there and the kind of demography that Kashmir has. So after Sheikh Abdullah was arrested and jailed without charges for 20 years, 20 years is a lifetime. I mean, it's a, you can imagine if somebody loses 20 years to bogus charges, you can imagine the kind of impact it had. It was essentially asking for justice to his people who had suffered serfdom under the Dogra rulers, under the Sikh rulers, and for centuries they were reduced to serfs. So he was essentially asking for land reforms. He in fact delivered land reforms. That is when the establishment turned against him, and they were very deeply suspicious of him, and they ensured that he lands in jail for next 20 years. So you didn't like people like him, representative people like him, who will demand what was promised to him. So then you had a succession of puppets, and farcical elections took place till 1989 before it degenerated into militant violence. So what was promised wasn't delivered, and there was the deep state was given a free run again to ensure political status quo. These puppets were given money. Corruption became a state policy in Kashmir, and this antagonized, the patronage networks were created which antagonized the majority of the people, and the state relied on the deep state to ensure political status quo. So, and the overbearing nature of the state, denial of basic rights, denial of democracy. While democracy flourished in rest of India and became an example and shining example for the rest of the world, that was denied to people of Kashmir again because of the suspicion of the majority population there. So eventually it regenerated into militant violence, and the manner in which the state responded with brute force. You have massacres. William Dalrymple has called them the worst atrocities that he had ever seen. Massacres, sexual violence. Then and by the middle of in the middle of 90s, the homegrown militancy virtually disappeared. And then you had, instead of doing a course correction, the state unleashed these people, they ironically called Ikhwanis, who were Sarkari terrorists, and they had arms and ammunition. They were used as death squads, and then they were used as counterinsurgents and given a free hand. Basically, the dirty job was outsourced to these people. So, and again, since there was no, had media played a more positive role, it would have questioned these extra constitutional measures that have been taken in Kashmir, created that public opinion for, and held the government accountable, held the state accountable for what it was doing in Kashmir. We would have not, we would have, you know, we wouldn't have been here where we actually find ourselves in. And by the starting from 2004, you can go and check the figures of the Home Ministry. Militant violence has dropped dramatically. All parameters, whatever the parameters, your infiltration and all parameters, it has dropped. And from 2008 to 2010, there were these street protests which happened essentially because they were about militarization, the state's refusal to end militarization and these draconian laws. The spark for the 2010 agitation was that 3 people were killed, not for the first time, were picked up, and they were killed, their bodies were mutilated, and they were passed off as Pakistani terrorists. And this was the spark for the 2010. Again, media showed it, you know, distorted. When kids were getting killed, they were showing visuals of cops getting beaten up. So instead of creating that accountability for these cops, paramilitary forces who were shooting at people while they were unarmed, in violation of normal policing rules, where firing is the last resort, and if you are forced to fire, you don't fire above the waistline to kill people. So, and since it becomes a nationalist passions are aroused, so this questioning doesn't happen, that if you had to shoot people, you are not allowed to shoot people above their waistline, you're not allowed to shoot to kill, and shooting is the last resort, but they shoot at people there at the drop of the hat. So again, the media media played a constructive role and asked these serious questions, instead of planting stories and having these panelists who will float these conspiracy theories about unarmed protests, about everything there. So you give currency and that becomes the dominant narrative. So the real questions, for instance, why are you firing at people and young kids? There were young kids as young as, I've documented this story of a 9-year-old boy who was killed. He was shot in his chest, and the day when the boy was killed, shot in his chest, and he bled to death on a road, throughout that day, the television channels were showing a cop getting beaten up. So this is how the media has distorted a story and has lost an opportunity of molding public opinion for just resolution of the Kashmir problem. And this example about these 3 men, and this wasn't the first time. And as early this year, there was this famous case of Patribal, where again 5 people were picked up, killed, they were decapitated, and they were passed off as Pakistani terrorists. And this was one of the rare cases which was allowed to be freely investigated. And CBI almost had a watertight case. And because of this Armed Forces Special Powers Act, even Supreme Court said we can't do nothing. So they gave Army an option to deal with the case, and Army just closed the case without even bothering to explain why they had closed the case. So the examples like these, this was the time, around the same time when a Kashmiri man was hung for indirect role, for conspiracy, for being involved in the conspiracy to attack the parliament, and the Supreme Court said it will satisfy the collective conscience of the people. And around the same time, the same Supreme Court allows these 5. They're not just allowed to go scot-free; they get promotions and rewards. These 5, and it was proved beyond doubt that these men were kidnapped. Their bodies were decapitated. There's a New York Times long piece, piece where that New York Times reporter explains when their bodies were exhumed, how one part of the body was lying in one grave, the another part of the body was lying in another grave. So they were identifying their kin from the marks of some mark on the head, something there, some nose there, and how they were. I mean, it's a very moving way how that New York Times reporter has explained that. So despite this being the rarest of rare cases, which Supreme Court has itself defined what are the rarest of rare cases, it allowed them to go scot-free because of these laws. And so you can imagine, and how many people know about these things, and why hasn't it stirred the conscience of this country? It won't, because you are not shown the other side of the story. So it's a story of individuals, it's a story of people from my own family, and it's my story. One of the stories, one of the chapters is about me. It's about my detention in Jaipur, when Kashmiris have gone out of Kashmir, and the kind of witch hunt they have faced. So this story is about me as well. It's a story about my family. It's about my father. It's about my grandfather. It's about my friends. It's about my extended family. So it's a personal story, with historical perspective, and every argument that I'm making is substantiated by independent sources, facts, figures, and it's full of history, and it's full of personal stories. Personal stories. I mean, I was there. I can't describe the kind of fear one felt as a young 7-8-year-old. You see soldiers charging at you, dragging people out, humiliating them. If you were not killed during the early years in the 90s, you were humiliated. And then but the worst part was the kind of sexual violence and intimidation one saw. That was the worst of it. And then the little known thing that doesn't get talked very much is that there are estimates which suggest that 90% of the people there suffer from some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is another emergency that we face of mental health. So there's no closure. As I said, the only time we were close to some sense of closure in the Patribal case, where Supreme Court allowed the soldiers to get away. Even that chance went begging because of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And in last from 2008 and between 2008 and 2011, majority of the people were killed in security forces firing on unarmed protesters. And 2000 again, because of the media projection, between 2010 and 2008 and 2011, it's largely seen as Kashmiri stoning our brave soldiers and stuff like that. But for Kashmiris, it's about the death of 300 people, including kids, including this 9-year-old Asif that I have written about, including an 8-year-old Samir Rah, including 8-year-old Milad who was shot in his head, and then it was about this funeral. One person was killed, and his father was carrying his son's dead body to the graveyard, and how his funeral was attacked. He was beaten up trying to shield his son's dead body, and the blood from his head was falling onto the dead body of his son. So these are the visuals that get circulated but never get it was about stone pelting, Kashmiris pelting stones, ungrateful Kashmiris pelting stones at our brave soldiers. It wasn't about 9-year-old Milad. It wasn't about 9-year-old Asif. It wasn't about this funeral. It was about, soldiers getting stoned, our brave soldiers. No, the story was again turned into why aren't Kashmiris grateful to our army is great. We have had a history, a very troubled history with the army, and there were serious questions about selective rescue. And I met people who said when a helicopter came and it picked the Bihari laborers who were stuck, and the local people were beaten up. And there was army rescued. Army did a great job because army is trained. It has the discipline, training, and the resources to do the job. But even they were overwhelmed. The first installation that came underwater was at Srinagar Kant. So they were also overwhelmed. So the story became the story about the infallibility of army and how ungrateful Kashmiri versus the selfless army, and which disregarded the fact that we have had a very difficult history with the security, not just the army, the entire security establishment, particularly in the last 25 years. And the story was also about extraordinary volunteerism in the face of biblical proportions of the floods. 80% of the city was underwater, and all sorts of stories were getting planted in media. Improbable stories that a helicopter was stoned within the governor's house residence. It's impossible. Even if you are an official, your car would be checked 4 or 5 times. There's a set template in the manner in which Kashmir is covered, and it's always the subtext is always the good us versus the bad them. So it was again the good, we are doing selfless service to these unkind people, and see what these are doing. How can you, there were implausible things that were being reported. The fact that people are stoning their rescuers. How would, when 80% people are underwater and they're desperate and they're angry, and even if they're angry, it's not a big deal. And when you see your kids dying, the entire city is sinking. You had Hurricane Katrina in US in 2005. There were serious riots. There were shots fired at the rescue helicopters. So these things happen. But when the same thing happens in Kashmir, where again it's different demography, the dehumanized lot, it takes a completely new meaning. There's a lot of money that's involved. There are officials who tell you of the record that money, a lot of money is claimed in the name of counterinsurgency, in keeping the pot boiling. So it's also vested interest. There are top government officials who will not dare to speak about this on record, but they tell us of the record. There's a lot of money involved. I left Kashmir Valley in 2004, and it had reached a point I always wanted to write, and in long form in particular. But living in Kashmir, you thought it was just your destiny. You live with it. It was just normal. It became routine after some time. That we also, at personally, you become dehumanized. I mean, the kind of violence one saw, you tend to believe that it's normal. And then when I came to Delhi, and you realize, I mean, something was, say for instance, there was this beheadings that happened on the border LOC, and the kind of the national outrage, and it lasts for days. It's continuously talked about on media. There's so much outrage. There are talks of going to war, and then these things strike you. That in Patripal also people were beheaded and their bodies were decapitated. What about them? I mean, these are the things. And then and people will. Yesterday there was somebody who came up to me and said, "Hey, you have done this to us. You've done to that." So I want to tell the other side of the story. And I mean, maybe perhaps you have also done something to us as well. So here it is.